Valentino Rossi is a god in the world of motorcycle road racing. The 9 times world champion from Italy, also known as the Doctor, has an immense list of mind-blowing career achievements that not only put him in the conversation as being one of the greatest motorcycle racers of all time, but the argument could be made that Valentino Rossi is one of the greatest athletes of all time. His career achievements and domination in his sport rivals that of any other iconic athlete that didn't just dominate their era, but transcended their sport. Rossi won a staggering 115 Grand Prix races over 3 different classes. He stood on the podium 235 times. He won races on 7 different types of motorcycles and has the longest winning Grand Prix racing career that spans 20 years and 311 days. He was also part of some of the most infamous and memorable MotoGP rivalries of all time, with some of history's greatest riders such as Sete Gibernau, Danny Pedrosa, Casey Stoner, Jorge Lorenzo, Max Biaggi, and Marc Marquez. So in today's video, we'll take a look at the iconic career of Valentino Rossi and how he revolutionized the sport of Grand Prix motorcycle racing.
Attenzione qua, Rossi c'è!
Valentino Rossi entered the World Championships in 1996 as a 17-year-old highly coveted motorcycle prodigy who had just dominated the prestigious Italian 125 championships. It wouldn't take long for the Italian teenager to make his mark on Grand Prix racing. He would score his first ever podium just 10 races in with a 3rd place finish in the 1996 Austrian Grand Prix. In the following race, which was the 1996 Czech Republic Grand Prix, Rossi would score his very first race victory in the 125cc class. He would go on to finish his first season in the 125 championships in 9th place with 111 points. In 1997, it would be Valentino Rossi's 2nd season in the 125 class. And just as he did in the 2nd year of the Italian Sport Production Championships, he would go on to dominate that season, winning 11 out of the 15 races, and becoming one of the youngest Grand Prix world champions in history. While the Grand Prix racing world has seen its fair share of young and up-and-coming prodigies, there was something much different about Rossi. Not only did he have gobs of natural talent, but he had this charm and charisma to him that we hadn't seen since the days of Barry Sheen. It's as if he knew at just 17 years old the art of showmanship and marketing. Rossi would entertain the crowds with these unique post-race celebrations, such as dressing up as Robin Hood and shooting an arrow into the crowd after winning the Donington GP. He would wear flashy yellow gear, he had a specially designed sun and moon helmet, and he started branding the number 46 as an identity to his racing career. And after securing the championship in the 125cc class, he wore this large number 1 and strapped it to his back and took a parade lap. But it goes much further than that. While the fans and the media were obviously entertained with these post-race antics, they were not just for showmanship. Rossi used these many times as ways to play mind games with the competition. Like after winning his home Grand Prix in Mugello that year, Rossi began to take shots at another famous Italian rider and then 250cc world champion Max Biaggi. When on the cool-down lap after the race, he strapped an inflatable sex doll to his back and christened it Claudia Schiffer, which was a direct dig at Biaggi and his then-girlfriend Naomi Campbell. So even at 17 years old, Rossi was like motorcycling's version of Muhammad Ali, who was able to talk the talk and walk the walk. So after winning the 125 title in 1997, Rossi moved up to the 250 class with Aprilia. And just like his first year in the Italian Sport Production Championships and the 125 World Championships, his first season in the 250s came with some mixed results. However, just 9 races in, Rossi would score his very first victory in the 250 class at the Dutch TT, winning by more than 19 seconds over 2nd place. He would go on to make a late season charge for the title with a flurry of victories in Imola and Argentina, but he would ultimately come up short, finishing the World Championships in second place, just 23 points shy of the 1998 250cc champ Loris Capirossi. As the 1999 season rolled around, it would mark the second year of Rossi in the 250 class. And just as he did in the second seasons of the Italian Sport Production Championships and the 125 class, he would go on to dominate the season, winning 9 out of the 15 races, granting him his first 250 World Championship title and his second title overall in Grand Prix racing. That year, Rossi also upped the ante with his post-race celebrations, starting with the infamous Guardian Angel celebration after his race win in Argentina. And of course, one of Rossi's personal favorites is when he stopped on the slowdown lap after winning in Spain. He leaped over the fence and then took a pee break in the Marshalls porta potty. After winning the 250 World Championship in 1999, Rossi would move up to the Premier class with Team Honda on the 500cc two-stroke. And in a carbon copy of Rossi's previous rookie seasons, he started off that first year in the 500 class with a series of crashes trying to acclimatize to the brutal power delivery of the Honda 500. But just 9 races in, Rossi would score his very first 500cc race victory at Donington. However, at the end of the season, it would be Kenny Roberts Jr. who would clinch that 2000 world title. In 2001, it would be Valentino Rossi's second season in the Premier class. And you know what second seasons in Valentino Rossi have in common? Domination. Rossi would go on to score 11 wins in his second season, only finishing off the podium 3 times. It was an absolute masterclass in motorcycle racing. And Rossi would set the tone that season from the very first race in Japan, when early on in the race he tangled with Max Biaggi, and it appeared that if Biaggi intentionally pushed him off track, Rossi would then pass Biaggi 1 lap later and flip him the bird in the middle of the corner. Now, not only was this a major talking point of the race, but Rossi was basically saying, "Don't F with me, Max, I will destroy you." When the 2002 season came around, Grand Prix racing would be moving from the 500cc two-strokes to the 900cc four-strokes. But only the 4 factory teams of Repsol Honda, Marlboro Yamaha, Suzuki, and Aprilia would be racing on 4-stroke machines, while all of the other satellite teams would remain on the 500cc two-strokes. And it was clear from the very first race of the season that the new 4-stroke machines were far superior to the two-strokes. And of course they should be. They had almost twice the displacement advantage. And Rossi was just not the best rider that season. He was also on the best bike. That version of the Honda RC211V was a work of art. It was head and shoulders above Yamaha, Suzuki, and Aprilia. And Rossi would go on to win 8 of the first 9 races that season, eventually claiming 11 victories in total. He would clinch his second Premier Class title, and it would be his first in the 4-stroke era and his 4th title overall. However, the year wasn't free of drama. Many pundits in the press and even Honda Motor Company themselves were claiming that Valentino Rossi's domination and victories that season were because of the top speed and the superior performance of the Honda RC211V, and not necessarily Valentino's riding. As one could imagine, this was a direct insult to someone of Valentino's caliber, and it would become the driving force in the near future for Rossi to leave Honda for Yamaha and take one of the biggest risks we've ever seen in motorsports. But more on that later. When the 2003 season came along, it would usher in a new era of competition for Rossi, with the addition of AMA Superbike champion Nicky Hayden and World Superbike champions Colin Edwards and Troy Bayliss. It was believed at the time that the 4-stroke specialists from World Superbikes could take the fight to Rossi. But the challenge that season wouldn't come from any of those riders, but the emerging Spaniard Sete Gibernau, who was riding on a Telefonica Movistar Honda. Rossi would begin the 2003 season on a mission by winning the first race at Suzuka, Japan. But unfortunately, this race would be marred by the fatal accident involving up-and-coming Japanese superstar and 250 world champion Daijiro Kato. Daijiro Kato was gifted and a very dominant 250 world champion. He was special. He won 17 races out of his very first 53 Grand Prix entries. He was also Sete Gibernau's teammate, and he was one of the riders who was expected to give Rossi a good fight. And it was unfortunate that we never got to see his true talents manifest. At the following race, which was the Grand Prix of South Africa, the MotoGP paddock paid tribute to Daijiro Kato with a moment of silence. And in an emotional and uplifting performance, his teammate Sete Gibernau would go on to win the South African Grand Prix. This win would elevate Sete from a mid-pack rider into a serious contender. Rossi and Gibernau would trade wins throughout the first part of the season, but in the second half of the season, we would see 5 different races between the two that would come down to the last lap, where Valentino Rossi would get the better of Sete Gibernau. It happened so often that the press began to think that Rossi was doing this for showmanship. Now, Rossi adamantly claimed that he was not. But most of the time in those races, it appeared that Gibernau was the faster of the two, and he would lead almost the entire race. But somehow, when it mattered the most, as he had done through his entire career, Valentino Rossi found the extra speed when extra speed was needed. And if there was any doubt up to that point that Rossi wasn't one of the greatest motorcycle racers of all time, he would squash any of those doubts with one of the greatest motorcycling performances that we would ever see at the Phillip Island Grand Prix, when he was given a 10-second penalty for overtaking Marco Melandri under yellow flags due to a crash from Troy Bayliss. After being informed of this penalty, Valentino Rossi laid down the hammer and smoked the field by more than 15 seconds, overcoming that penalty and winning the race. Rossi would continue to wear down Sete Gibernau and everyone else and go on to easily win the 2003 title in Malaysia. This would be his 3rd in the Premier class and his 5th world title overall. And as if there was not enough drama during the 2003 season, Rossi would cap it off by dropping one of the biggest bombshells ever in the history of motorsports by announcing that he was going to be leaving the almighty and powerful Repsol Honda team for the downtrodden Team Yamaha. Now, back then, MotoGP was very cruel to Yamaha. They had only won 2 of the last 39 Grand Prix, and they hadn't secured a world championship since Wayne Rainey in 1992. And at the time, this seemed like it was career suicide because Valentino Rossi was dominant on the Honda. He had won 33 races out of the first 48 starts that he had. And to shed some more light on just how much of a risk he was taking, we would learn several years later that Yamaha was inches away from folding up their MotoGP operations when they signed Rossi. They only committed financially to the first 3 races of 2004. They never even told Valentino Rossi that his first 3 races on a Yamaha were make or break for both his career and the future of Yamaha. And little did we know at the time that this would change the fortunes of both Yamaha and cement Valentino Rossi as the greatest rider of his era. As you can imagine, the 2004 MotoGP season was one of the most anticipated ever. Rossi was on a quest to prove the doubters that he was the best, not Honda. Honda would up the drama by signing none other than Valentino Rossi's arch nemesis Max Biaggi, who joined Honda Pons, as well as giving full factory spec motorcycles to Sete Gibernau. So all eyes were on the opening Grand Prix in South Africa, and what would unfold would become one of the greatest moments in MotoGP history. Rossi on the Yamaha, Biaggi on the Honda. They went head-to-head from the very first corner to the last, changing the lead several times. You couldn't separate the two with a piece of paper. But when he needed it the most, Valentino Rossi found just enough speed to clip Max Biaggi at the line and take his very first victory for Team Yamaha. This would make Valentino Rossi the first ever rider to win consecutive races with different manufacturers, having won the final race at the previous season on his Honda and now the opening round in South Africa on his Yamaha. Overcome with emotion, Valentino rode off the track, collapsed, and had himself a good laugh. And as much as all of us who were watching this couldn't believe what we had just witnessed, I think we all realized in that moment that Rossi even surprised himself. Now that would be it that season for Max Biaggi. He would never really become a factor after that. But Sete Gibernau would try to step up and make this championship close, only to get stuffed by Rossi again in the final stages of 3 consecutive races in Italy, Catalunya, and Assen. And the pass during the last lap at Assen was so aggressive that the two collided, almost crashing them both. And you could tell during the post-race celebrations that Sete Gibernau was pissed over this incident and began to complain about Rossi's aggressive riding style. He had to do something, and do something fast, to stop Rossi's momentum. But what he would ultimately choose to do would put the nail in his coffin for not just the 2004 season, but also for the remainder of Sete Gibernau's career. At round 13 of the championships that season, it was hosted by the newly built Losail International Circuit in Qatar. Being a newly built circuit in the middle of the desert, the track was struggling to keep sand off the main racing line. After qualifying, members of Rossi's crew were reported to racing stewards for sweeping sand off of Valentino Rossi's grid spot, which is a clear violation of rules. After reviewing the incident, the race stewards penalized Rossi, forcing him to start at the back of the grid. And to make matters worse, Sete Gibernau had qualified on pole position. Now Rossi would ride like a man possessed, but ultimately would crash out while riding in 4th place, and Sete Gibernau would go on to win that race. Now, after the Qatar incident, Rossi let it be known that he felt that Gibernau and his Telefonica Movistar team were behind the protest that led him to being penalized. Valentino was so angry that he swore, as long as he was in Grand Prix racing, that Gibernau would never win another race. And unfortunately for Sete Gibernau, this would become true, as he never would win another Grand Prix after that. At the next race in Malaysia, Rossi would back up his words with an easy victory. And then after the race, Rossi would throw a shot at both the race stewards and Gibernau over the Qatar incident by getting out a broom and sweeping the ground in front of his Yamaha. Now, Rossi would go on to win the remaining 3 races that season and finish with a total of 9 victories that year. He would clinch his 3rd world title in the 4-stroke era and his 4th title overall in the Premier class and his 6th in the World Championships. In 2005, it would be Rossi's 2nd season with Team Yamaha, and I don't have to tell you what happens with 2nd seasons in Valentino Rossi. He proved to be even more dominant than the year before. He immediately began the season by winning the first round in Spain, but not without controversy, as during the last corner of the last lap, the victory came down to him and, yes, Sete Gibernau. Rossi, true to form and his words, in a display of will and aggression, dove on the inside of Gibernau, barn-dooring him right off the track. Gibernau and his team would protest Rossi's reckless and impetuous riding, but in the end, the stewards claimed it was just a racing incident, and the victory was Rossi's to keep. From that moment on, that pretty much put a fork in Sete Gibernau. Rossi would go on to finish that season with another 11 race wins, capturing his 5th top-class title and 7th overall championship. When the 2006 season rolled around, it was no surprise that Rossi once again was the favorite to win the title. However, over Rossi's career, he was blessed with good fortune. But this would be the year where those fortunes would change. He would suffer mechanical failures in France and the United States. A chunk of rubber would come flying off his rear tire, forcing him to retire at the Chinese Grand Prix. But things would go from bad to worse for Valentino when at the Assen GP that year, he would high-side his Yamaha during practice and was left with a fractured wrist, a hole in his elbow, and a severely sprained ankle. Now, against the advice of Grand Prix medical directors, he decided to race the Assen GP anyway, starting from 18th position on the grid. And in a tremendous show of courage, a battered Valentino Rossi somehow clawed his way to a respectable 8th place finish. But he gave up significant ground to championship leader Nicky Hayden. But going into the penultimate championship round in Portugal, Rossi's championship hopes seemed to be all but over. He needed a lucky break and he would get one. When during the race, Nicky Hayden, the championship leader, was taken out in a bizarre fashion by his own teammate Danny Pedrosa, causing both of the riders to crash out and retire. Tony Elias, who was riding in third place, would overtake both Kenny Roberts Jr. and Rossi on the very last lap to take the lead and go on to win the race by a minuscule 0.0002 of a second. Now, even though Valentino didn't win the race, the incident between Hayden and Pedrosa was enough to give Valentino Rossi an edge in the championship going into the final round in Valencia by 8 points over Nicky Hayden. So in spite of all the bad luck he had that season, he just needed to finish ahead of Nicky Hayden to win his 8th world title. Now, this seemed like a foregone conclusion, because anytime that Rossi needed to deliver, that's exactly what he did. But this time, it would be different, because on lap 5 at Valencia, he would make a mistake and lose the front end of his Yamaha and crash. He would manage to get going again, but would only finish 13th, ultimately losing the title to Nicky Hayden by just 5 points. And Rossi's 5-year run at the top of the MotoGP empire was over, and Nicky Hayden was your new MotoGP world champion. Now, after Valentino lost the title in 2006, he was determined to reclaim it again in 2007. And there was this feeling that Rossi was still the man to beat. But that was about to change when a new legend would emerge in the form of Casey Stoner. Casey Stoner was in his second Grand Prix season, and he had just signed a deal with Ducati, and Rossi simply had no answer for Casey Stoner. Everything that he threw at Stoner that season that had worked on previous riders for years just wouldn't cut it with Stoner. After losing 4 of 6 races, Rossi tried everything he could to shut down Stoner's momentum at Catalunya. And despite his best efforts, Rossi was beaten hands down, leaving them to say after the race that Stoner rides like a god. And Stoner would easily go on to win the title. Rossi, on the other hand, would finish in third place with 241 points. And after 2 frustrating seasons where Valentino Rossi and Team Yamaha lost the title to Nicky Hayden's Honda and Casey Stoner's Ducati, critics started to doubt if Valentino was capable of ever winning another title. In the 2008 season, many people believed that this was going to become the era of Casey Stoner and that he would easily go on to win the title. And halfway through the season, that is exactly what it looked like, because Stoner won 4 of the first 10 races. But it would all come down to another historical and iconic MotoGP battle for the ages involving Valentino Rossi. When at the Laguna Seca round in the United States, Casey Stoner was clearly the fastest rider that day. Rossi would say during the pre-race conference that the only way someone could stop Stoner is if they had a gun. But Rossi wouldn't need a gun, just his legendary race acumen. When the race began, Rossi jumped immediately out front and spent the entire race blocking Casey Stoner. He knew that if Stoner got in front of him, the race would be over, and he simply was not going to let that happen. Now, Stoner would overtake Rossi on the entrance to the infamous corkscrew, only to see Valentino Rossi pass him in the dirt. And this was another all-out Hail Mary pass that we had come to see from Valentino Rossi. Now, this pass obviously flustered Casey Stoner because a few laps later, he would run off the track while trying to pass Rossi in the final corner. Casey Stoner would be able to remount, but ultimately ended up finishing second that race to Valentino. Now, Casey Stoner, much like Sete Gibernau, was not a fan of Valentino Rossi's aggressive riding style. Stoner would go on to win a few races that year, but he clearly didn't look like the Casey Stoner that we had seen in the 2007 seasons and the earlier parts of 2008. And that was enough for Rossi to reclaim his authority over the MotoGP empire by winning his 8th championship, edging out Stoner by 93 points. In 2009, Valentino Rossi would receive a very stiff challenge from his younger teammate Jorge Lorenzo. But just like he did with Sete Gibernau and Jerez and Casey Stoner in Laguna Seca, as soon as Jorge Lorenzo got a whiff of confidence and thought he might stand a chance in this championship, Rossi shut him down, making another pass for the ages on the last lap in the last corner at the Catalunya GP. This was a place that no one had ever made a pass on a motorcycle before. And that kind of let Jorge know who was still the main rider at Yamaha. Now, however, his main competition the previous season, Casey Stoner, didn't look himself. Stoner would later go on to miss a series of Grand Prix for health reasons, and at the time he was diagnosed as being lactose intolerant. But years later it would come out that he was actually suffering from Epstein-Barr or chronic fatigue syndrome, which he still suffers from today. Now, later that season at the Assen round, Valentino would go on to win his 100th Grand Prix race, becoming only the second rider in history to surpass 100 total wins, placing him second all-time behind the 122 victories of Grand Prix racing legend Giacomo Agostini. Rossi would go on to finish first in the championship with 306 points, 72 clear of second-place Jorge Lorenzo. When the 2010 season came around, it would be another dominant year for Team Yamaha. But it wouldn't come this time from Rossi, it would come from his teammate Jorge Lorenzo. Jorge's inch-perfect precision and his ability to consistently turn out fast laps throughout the whole race made him difficult to beat. But the year would get worse for Valentino when during his home Grand Prix in Mugello, Italy, Rossi would high-side his Yamaha in one of the fast right-left-hand combinations. He would suffer a displaced compound fracture of his right tibia. Now, this crushed any hopes of him winning the 2010 title, and it was the first time that Rossi would be missing a Grand Prix race in his career. But as the saying goes, you can't keep a good man down, and just 1 month after breaking his leg, Rossi would return to competition at the German Grand Prix. And remarkably, he would finish just off the podium in 4th position. Rossi would put in a valiant effort throughout the remainder of the season, but he would go on to finish 3rd in the championship behind eventual champion Jorge Lorenzo. Now, in 2011, Rossi would send shockwaves through the motorcycling community again by announcing that he would be leaving Team Yamaha for Team Ducati. But Valentino never got along with the Ducati, certainly not the way that Casey Stoner did, and he would go winless throughout the 2011 season. This would be the first time ever in Valentino Rossi's illustrious career that he failed to win a race during a Grand Prix season. Unfortunately, what would be remembered most about the 2011 season would be the tragic death of up-and-coming Italian superstar and former 250 world champion Marco Simoncelli at the Malaysian round, where on the second lap of the race, Valentino Rossi and Colin Edwards were in a bizarre collision involving Simoncelli, who was his best friend, when Simoncelli lost control of his bike, sending him right in front of Rossi and Edwards, and they struck Simoncelli in the head and chest. The blow resulted in the Italian suffering critical injuries where he would later die in a hospital. And this was another tragic loss for the world of motorcycling, as Marco Simoncelli was fast, fearless, and charismatic. He put on a show every time he got on a bike, and fans loved him for that. And much like Daijiro Kato, it was sad that he was taken from us too soon. Now, Rossi would go on to finish the 2011 season 7th in the championship behind eventual winner Casey Stoner. In 2012, Rossi would stay with Ducati, but it would be more of the same. He would never win another race and would just never really come to grips with that motorcycle. Ultimately, he would finish 6th in the championship with 163 points, a total of 187 behind eventual champion Jorge Lorenzo. In 2013, Rossi announced that he would be leaving Ducati to return to Team Yamaha. But the landscape of MotoGP had changed with the arrival of Marc Marquez. Marquez was fast, aggressive, and fearless, possessing all of the qualities, minus the charisma, that Valentino Rossi had when he was young. Marquez would reinvent MotoGP with his elbow-down riding style, and there wasn't anything at the time that anyone could do about it. That year, Marquez would do a Rossi on Rossi by passing him in the corkscrew in the dirt during the United States Grand Prix. But at the Dutch round, Rossi would break his 46-long race winless streak by recording his very first MotoGP win since Malaysia in 2010. Rossi would end up finishing fourth that year in the championship with 237 points, and he finished a respectable 97 points clear of eventual champion Marc Marquez. In 2014, Valentino would continue to struggle against the likes of Marquez and Lorenzo. In fact, everybody would struggle that year with Marquez as he won 13 out of the 18 races that season and easily coasted to the MotoGP title. Rossi had a very consistent season, winning 2 Grand Prix that year and finishing on the podium 13 out of those 18 races. But it still wouldn't be enough to overcome the record-breaking year of Marc Marquez. Now, when the 2015 season came around, none of us would have imagined what we would witness would be one of the most dramatic and darkest MotoGP seasons in history. Over his entire Grand Prix racing career, Rossi has always responded to any challenges that would threaten his MotoGP throne, and there was no way that he was going to let Marc Marquez run away with another title. And 2015 would be a showdown for the ages, but not in the manner that all of us had thought. And it would change the fortunes of Valentino Rossi, Marc Marquez, and Jorge Lorenzo forever. Rossi started out the 2015 season taking a victory at the opening race in Qatar. But at the third round in Argentina, things would heat up when Rossi chased down Marc Marquez for the lead before the two riders would collide on the penultimate lap. Rossi would stay upright, but Marquez would crash out of the race. Now, Marquez downplayed this altercation, saying it was just a racing incident. But truly in his mind, he felt that Rossi purposely cut in front of him, causing him to crash. So 4 rounds later at the Assen GP, the two would be involved in a back-and-forth battle for the lead, when on the last lap, at the last corner, Marc Marquez would aggressively dive on the inside of Valentino Rossi and make what looked at the time to be a pass for the win. But Valentino Rossi would stand up his bike, wheelie it through the dirt, and cut a portion of the track, ending up in front of Marc Marquez and crossing the finish line in first place. Now, Marc Marquez believed that his aggressive pass was fair and clean, and that Rossi cut the track on purpose and cheated. Valentino claimed that Marquez ran him off the track on purpose, leaving him no choice. But race stewards ultimately sided with Rossi and deemed that yet again it was just a racing incident, and Rossi kept the win. In years past, this aggressive win-at-all-cost mentality gave Rossi the edge over the likes of Casey Stoner and Sete Gibernau. But Marc Marquez was different. He shared every bit of the win-at-all-cost mentality that Rossi did, and that would lead to a serious problem later that year at the Australian Grand Prix. At the Australian Grand Prix, it was a fierce battle between Rossi, Marquez, Lorenzo, and Andre Ioni. They had more than 50 different overtakes between the top 4 throughout the race. Now, Marquez would go on to set the fastest lap on the final lap to take the victory. But at the very next round at Malaysia during the press conference, Rossi made a comment that he felt Marc Marquez was purposely blocking him at Phillip Island in the attempts to help his fellow Spaniard Jorge Lorenzo win the world title. Now, this comment would set the stage for the Malaysian GP to become one of the most infamous races in the sport's history. While running in third place, Marquez seemed to back down his pace and engage in a road racing's version of a dogfight with Valentino Rossi, who was in fourth. There would be a total of 18 different overtakes and exchanges of positions between the two, until on the 7th lap of the race, when Rossi made a move on Marquez at turn 14, pushing Marquez off the circuit and causing him to crash. Now, Rossi would stay upright and would go on to take third place in the race behind Jorge Lorenzo and winner Dani Pedrosa. But when Race Direction reviewed the incident, they deemed that Rossi was at fault for the collision on Marquez. Now, he would get to keep his third place finish, but this meant that Rossi would be forced to start the final race at Valencia from the back of the grid with only a slim 4-point lead in the championship over Jorge Lorenzo. Even though Rossi would start at the back of the grid in Valencia, he would claw his way up to 4th position. But Jorge Lorenzo would go on to win that race over Marc Marquez by 0.2 of a second. The win would be just enough for Jorge Lorenzo to win the 2015 MotoGP championships by a meager 5 points over Rossi. To this day, the feud between Marquez and Rossi still continues. And unfortunately for Valentino, that would be the closest he would ever come to clinching a world title again. He would win 2 races in 2016, and then he would take his last Grand Prix victory in 2017 at the Assen circuit. But from 2017 up to announcing his retirement in 2021, Rossi was never able to recapture his magic as Father Time would catch up with him, and a younger Marc Marquez would continue to rule the MotoGP landscape, and the up-and-coming crop of younger, hungrier riders would prove to be too much for Rossi. It's a delicate decision for any all-time great to call it quits and retire from their sport. Some retire way too early, leaving fans to wonder what could have been, while some all-time greats stay way too long, tarnishing their legacy as the world sadly watches them deteriorate in front of their eyes. But Rossi was different. Even into his 40s, he was still a top 5 rider. He was still kicking the asses of men half his age. But the question is, how did he revolutionize the sport of Grand Prix motorcycle racing? And is he the greatest of all time? Well, let's start out with statistics. He won more races in the modern era than anyone else, including all of his main rivals by a long shot. And he did it over a longer period of time than anyone else. And only the great Giacomo Agostini from the 60s and 70s has more wins and championships. But that was an entirely different era, where racers raced multiple classes in a single day under much different rules. Rossi also won a championship in every category of motorcycle racing that he ever competed in, from the day that he was born until the day that he retired. And when he entered Grand Prix racing, he was beating men that were twice his age. And when he left, he was beating men half of his age. He went toe-to-toe with some of MotoGP's greatest superstars and legends, and most of the time, he got the better of them. So on statistics alone, he's easily the greatest motorcycle racer of the modern era, no question. And in the greatest of all time conversation, he can only be compared to the great Giacomo Agostini, and depending on how many libations you've had to drink, you could honestly make a clear argument for either one of them. But what made Rossi so great, and how he revolutionized the sport of motorcycle road racing, is what's not listed on the statistics sheet. Much like the Michael Jordan and LeBron James debate, statistics do not tell the whole story. If we were just looking at statistics, one could easily say that LeBron James is the greatest basketball player that ever lived. But you watch some video of Michael Jordan playing basketball, and you tell me who you think's the best of all time. And that's how it was with Valentino Rossi. You had to see it to believe it, because he was the greatest clutch rider of all time. Whenever he needed speed, whenever he needed a victory, he got it. And unlike Mick Doohan from the prior generation, who just showed up, punched everybody square in the mouth, totally dominated him, and then went home, Rossi rarely dominated a race. And that was the beauty of it. He was often lurking in second or third with just a few laps remaining. But everybody in the world knew somehow, some way, this man was going to throw an epic last lap Hail Mary pass and somehow pull this thing off. I mean, you knew it was coming. Hell, even the riders knew it was coming, but they couldn't stop it. And then after he won, you knew he was going to treat the crowd to some wild celebration, like throwing some bowling pins, the ball and chain, kissing the ground, or the notarized world title celebration. You just never knew what was up this man's sleeve. Rossi was the biggest draw on the biggest stage, because in his era, you didn't show up to watch MotoGP. You showed up to watch Valentino Rossi. Fans, sports stars, A-list celebrities, they came from all around the world to witness the legend himself. He became the highest paid motorcycle racer of all time and one of the highest paid athletes, period. He became a national hero in his home country, and if video didn't exist of his achievements, you would think this was all just folklore. He was so popular that even Formula One wanted a piece of Valentino Rossi. He stood larger than the sport, he stood larger than life, and he did so because Rossi made MotoGP fun. He seemed to enjoy the thrill of racing and the thrill of entertaining people. And since his retirement, he's given back to the sport by creating the VR Racing Academy to groom younger talent, and also with his MotoGP race team, Mooney VR46 Racing. And also he's gone on to become a very successful car racer where he's still racing and still entertaining. It's as if he was put on this earth to do just that, to race and to entertain. In sports talk today, we're constantly bombarded with the overuse of the acronym GOAT, the greatest of all time. And now the new phrase seems to be, I'm him. But the truth is most GOATs aren't GOATs, and most athletes are not him. It's just sports clickbait. But Valentino Rossi was the GOAT. He was him. He put a sport on his back and carried it into a new era. He got people interested in motorcycle racing, and he spawned a whole new generation of legendary riders. He was loved by the masses and respected by his enemies. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if one thinks he's the GOAT or not, or where he stands in the mind of social media and the press. All that matters is that you and I were lucky enough to be alive and witness what a true, once-in-a-lifetime great looks like. Because chances are you're never going to see the likes of him again.